Hey everyone, I'm Megyn Kelly. Welcome to the Megyn Kelly Show and today's deep dive special episode that you're going to want to hear. Today, we are taking a very specific look at one very specific Minnesota law, thanks to Governor and now VP candidate Tim Walz, that the corporate media continues to get totally wrong and continues to tell you doesn't exist or do all the things that I have been telling you it does. I'm going to give you an example, okay? I've been talking about it on this show, and then recently I went on the road with Tucker Carlson and explained to him what will happen as a result of this Minnesota so-called trans refuge law. And many people can't believe their ears. It's so radical. And they think, I must have my facts wrong. I must be spinning this. Well, I don't, and I'm not. Before I went out and spoke about this publicly, I did my homework. As you know, I'm a lawyer, and I consulted with many experts, both inside and outside of Minnesota, on whether this law did what my own lion eyes told me that it did. They weren't lying. They were right. And I'll just give you a flavor for the discussion with Tucker. You can see the whole thing online, but here's what I said.
I come here and someone's like, are you going to ask her about Taylor Swift?
I've got thoughts.
So,
Screw you, Taylor Swift. She turns around. Not only does she pick a side in a hotly contested presidential election, alienating at least half of her fan base, but she says the reason she's voting for Kamala Harris is because of Tim Walz's LGBTQ stance. Do you know what Tim Walz has done on the LGBTQ front? Let me tell you what's going to happen, okay? Here's what's going to happen. A little girl sitting in Wisconsin who's maybe on the spectrum, maybe has acne, maybe is a little heavy set, maybe feels upset because the parents are getting divorced, something like that, is going to find herself down a rabbit hole on Reddit. And her parents aren't going to know because they're getting a divorce and they're not focused on her right now. And she's going to spend hour after hour on that thing, and Reddit's going to tell her she's actually a boy. And she's going to get sucked into this gender cult. And she's going to say, Mom and Dad, I want puberty blockers into cross-sex hormones, which will sterilize her and deprive her of all sexual pleasure for the rest of her life. And they're going to say, no, you're a girl. And she's going to say, but I want top surgery, this benign thing, this double mastectomy where I'll have tubes coming out of me and I'll never breastfeed a child. I want that too, because I'm a boy. And they're going to say no. And she's going to go to a judge in Minnesota, and because of Tim Walz, the court will take custody of her, use the Medicaid funds in Minnesota to provide her all of those things, chop off her breasts, sterilize her with the puberty blockers into the cross-sex hormones. And when this girl inevitably comes to the conclusion that she didn't want any of this, that it only added to her problems, which were the divorce and the acne and the puberty and not any trans issue, who is she going to go to then? This is all because of Tim Walz. That's what Minnesota is doing right now to little girls and boys, taking custody away from the parents so that they can have these procedures without any loving parent there to help. And that's what Taylor Swift just endorsed for your children. So screw you, Taylor Swift.
So that is my interpretation of the law. And now I've brought on two legal experts on this law to talk about it. We are joined now by Bob Roby. He's a Minnesota attorney, a family law attorney, who was almost going to testify about this law, but we'll get into what happened. And Matt Sharp, who's senior counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom, which has been speaking out about it ever since it was in debate. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe to this show on YouTube and follow me on Insta, Facebook, and X. If you're tired of the same old coffee from those mega corporations pushing their woke agendas, listen up. It's time to take a stand and support a brand that truly embodies American values, Blackout Coffee. They stand with hardworking Americans who believe in family, faith, and freedom. They roast some of the most incredible coffee you will ever taste using only premium grade beans, roasted and shipped to you within 48 hours. And for the cold brew fans, Blackout Coffee is excited to announce the launch of their 2 new ready-to-drink cold brew coffee latte options. Don't settle for less. Make the switch to Blackout Coffee. Head on over to blackoutcoffee.com/MK or use the code MK for 20% off your first order. That's blackoutcoffee.com/MK. The code is MK. Join the movement and taste the difference Remember, with every sip, you're supporting a brand that stands for America. Be awake, not woke. Guys, thank you both so much for being here. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Okay, so Bob, you are one of the many experts I spoke with before I went out there and commented at all on this thing months ago. And you tell me whether I have overstated the draconian nature of this law.
No, the scenario you set up is absolutely spot on as far as what this law does. There's no question about it. When a bill uses terms like emergency custody and describes, what would warrant a court taking emergency custody in a case, you got to pay attention. I mean, it defines gender affirming care, which the bill puts in the category of neglect or abuse, warranting emergency custody by a judge. And it defines gender affirming care, which is a total euphemism. I mean, gender, what's caring? That's gender. You're denying care. That's what the Minnesota narrative has been crafted into this bill. And it's defining it to include the very things you talked about, any kind of hormone blockers, any kind of, and it's the classic scenario. This has happened. This is not just a theory. I mean, Washington Examiner reported on this thing with Abigail Martinez's daughter, who was put on testosterone hormones and ended up throwing herself in front of a train, and they had to pick up her pieces. And this has happened. This is a nightmare for people in Minnesota and anyone whose kid might end up there.
Matt, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, I take it one step further, Megyn. Not only would this apply if a girl is in Minnesota, but let's say you have a young lady living in Ohio and she has a woke aunt that says, you know what, I think you would benefit from puberty blockers and hormones. Let's take you to Minnesota. So she can now transport this minor to Minnesota and use this law to get custody of the girl and then start making decisions saying, I'm going to put you on the blockers. I'm going to put you on the hormones. I'm going to get you these surgeries, undermining that girl's parental rights back home in Ohio. So not only is this an affront to kids in Minnesota and harming them, but across the country, parents now have to worry about someone taking their child to Minnesota and stripping away their custody and their ability to protect kids from these dangerous drugs and surgeries.
So God forbid, Bob, this happened to me. Now I live in Connecticut. And suddenly my kids were, a child of mine were in Minnesota, and somebody, because it doesn't even have to be a relative that gets, it could be like Planned Parenthood that files the petition and says, we want to get this kid here in Minnesota. So now my husband and I remain in Connecticut. We are outraged. Where's our child? Who the hell filed a petition to get them into the jurisdiction of a court in Minnesota? And they're in Minnesota physically right now, and God knows what's going to happen. We would normally go to a court in Connecticut where we live, where, let's presume in this hypothetical, thank God, scenario, there's a psychiatrist who sees the child, and there's a teacher and everybody who's looking after the child's mental health along with my husband and me. And we would say to a Connecticut court, go give us our child back. Like, please issue a subpoena that we can run into Minnesota with saying, give us our child back. And that's how it would work in virtually all circumstances if somebody were to take your kid across state lines and try to keep him or her from you. But Bob, you tell me what would happen if we went to Minnesota with that subpoena from Connecticut thanks to this law.
Well, and in Minnesota, in dealing with abuse situations, and that's how this has been categorized by the bill. Mm-hmm. In dealing with abuse situations, you can imagine it's warranted for the court in the place where the child is found to be. If the child's immediate safety is at risk, then the court takes on jurisdiction for the safety of the child. So by putting this scenario into the category of cases that warrant exclusive and emergency jurisdiction, they are cutting out the Connecticut court, saying we have the kid here, the kid's at risk of harm, immediate harm, warranting our jurisdiction, so you don't have any. That's exactly
Because-
what this bill does.
Because they consider abusive not to give the kid this so-called gender affirming care.
Right. Exactly. That's what they've categorized. And to say that it's only for outstate kids is a bald-faced deception. I mean, if this is what warrants abuse in Minnesota, how do all parents in Minnesota think that this is not going to be used to measure their own family's situation in state? I mean, you can't say this is abuse for kids outside the state, but we're not going to protect, because that's the language now. We're not going to protect kids in the state. We're not going to apply this. No, you have an equal protection problem immediately. So you say you're protecting kids, you can't apply it to kids who are from other states and not your own kids. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's a bald-faced lie to say this isn't going to be applied to Minnesota kids. It's a standard that they've established now for neglect or abuse warranting emergency jurisdiction. And this is the scariest scenario. I mean, we've got, this has happened already in other states. And Walz, I mean, South Dakota outlawed these measures, these kind of treatments, along with the whole country of Sweden, who is way ahead of us on this. They did a full study, follow-up study of patients who went through trans surgery and treatments, and found that their suicide rate was 19 times higher. 19 times, not percent, 19 times higher than the average. And they banned all these things because they didn't want to hurt children. I don't know why Governor Walz, what he has against children, but it's pretty apparent.
Yeah. And let's just look at the language of the statute, Matt. It's HR 146, and it reads as follows in part: temporary emergency jurisdiction. A court of this state has temporary emergency jurisdiction if the child is present in this state and, sub 3, the child has been unable to obtain gender-affirming health care as defined in Section 543.23, paragraph B. What does that 543.23, paragraph B says? What does it say about gender-affirming health care? Gender-affirming health care means, quoting from the statute, medically necessary health care or mental health care that respects the gender identity of the patient as experienced and defined by the patient, and that may include but is not limited to 1, interventions to suppress the development of endogenous secondary sex characteristics, meaning puberty blockers. 2, interventions to align the patient's appearance or physical body with the patient's gender identity. 3, interventions to alleviate the patient's symptoms of clinically significant distress resulting from gender dysphoria. And it goes on from there. That covers all of it. Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries, period.
Yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. So you play out this scenario. Imagine you've got a mom and dad, and like you described, a young girl that she's maybe on the spectrum. She's dealing with confusion, anxiety, depression, other things. And the parents say, let's put a pause. Let's wait and see. And let's try and treat the other things first. What, as Bob was saying, so many European countries are doing, so many U.S. states are doing, is prioritizing good mental health care over this medicalization. But under this law, Minnesota courts now have the authority to use that emergency jurisdiction language you cited, and saying, because mom and dad, you will not give these girls puberty blockers, hormones, these dangerous, potentially sterilizing surgeries. We're going to take jurisdiction, and we're going to start deciding this is medically necessary, and immediately putting her on drugs, now allowing her to access these surgeries and everything else that comes with this. And as Bob said, this is not a hypothetical. We've actually had a case just across the state line from Minnesota in Wisconsin, where a school district there was socially transitioning a girl, pushing this teenage girl that was dealing with depression and anxiety during all of the COVID crisis, and pushing this girl towards embracing a male identity, hiding it from the parents, refusing the parents when they then tried to intervene and protect their daughter. So this law takes what's happening in Wisconsin and other states like it and magnifies it so that now the judges can order these kids to be put on these drugs and surgeries And the parents back home have no recourse. They can't get a subpoena. They can't do anything to protect their kid under this law. And that's ultimately going to do a lot of damage to kids in Minnesota and across the country that are going to continue to be damaged by this harmful gender ideology.
How can it be, Matt, that an unrelated adult can step in and be the person to spearhead this seizure of a loving parent couple's child? Like, I mean, I don't agree with it, but I can at least picture the nosy aunt interfering. But how can a Minnesota court say some stranger, let's say with the Human Rights Campaign or some GLAAD affiliated organization, can step in after receiving a complaint from a child they do not know and effectively wrest custody away from the parents without showing that they're abusive in any way other than they won't affirm this identity or allow these procedures?
Yeah, this is a direct attack on parental rights. There's no doubt about it. We have always respected the role of parents, of good mom and dads, to make decisions about their kids, to guide and whether it's their health care, their mental health, their education, whatever it is. And this Minnesota law says you don't even have to be a parent, just a adult acting in the role of as a parent. That could be anyone, like you said. It could be Planned Parenthood. It could be a profit-motivated gender clinic that says, child, come to Minnesota. We can get emergency jurisdiction and make sure that we're going to get you these drugs and these surgeries and do irreversible damage. And we'll take care of pushing your parents out of the picture, stripping away their custody, stripping away their ability to do it. So now you have this system that, like you said, an unrelated adult, someone at a gender clinic, someone at Planned Parenthood can misuse this law to insert themselves in the role of parent and strip away the ability of parents to safeguard their kids from this harmful gender ideology.
As I read the law, Bob, in Minnesota, Medicaid does have to cover these types of procedures for youth and others. And so it's also something that the taxpayers could potentially have to pay for if the child doesn't have the funds or if Planned Parenthood doesn't want to do it gratis, because they do some of this, at least the medicine doling out.
Yeah, well, that's part of the whole picture. When you take this scenario and plop it in the middle of a neglected or abused child's situation, you can certainly imagine if some kid was being trafficked and their parents are nowhere to be found, and some good Samaritan tries to bring the kid in and get help. That scenario, you could see, well, we shouldn't have to have the parents to help this kid, and meet the child's basic needs and keep the child safe. But when you take, this is unprecedented, that to say that define this type of situation as abuse or neglect, it's putting all of the mechanisms around it that are normally only warranted where a child's at risk of harm. South Dakota would say, you are the abuser, state of Minnesota, by doing, they've outlawed these things. So, I mean, it's putting Minnesota at a very hostile position with other states.
What happened, Bob? Because this was passed narrowly on a party line vote and then signed into law over, a very sharply divided, even in Minnesota, which is a blue state, by Governor Tim Walz. But so you were going to testify. You're a lifelong family attorney, and from what I understand, not some dyed-in-the-wool conservative. You were going to testify against this law. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of neutral work in this area, and I've been doing juvenile court cases, adoptions, contested adoptions. This is not a party issue. But I came down when some people alerted me to this, and they said they're going to try to pass this legislation. Would you come down and just talk about what you know? And I'd looked into the Swedish study that was done. I'd looked into the background, the homework, the facts, and this was just the policy behind this was insane. I was like, I'm going to go down there and talk to the Judiciary Committee about what are the facts behind this whole issue. You guys need to have that on the table. And I went down and I sat there, and the committee, which was controlled by Democrats, refused to allow anyone to testify, including me, that were, from the general public. They had the author of the bill and a doctor who was in a position to benefit from this bill were the only ones allowed to speak in the committee. And I made the trip down to St. Paul for nothing, apparently, that day. It was, but that's the kind of controlled. Now, if this issue got before a judge, the judge certainly wouldn't say, well, I'm only going to hear from people on one side. And so what's happening down at the St. Paul legislature in Minnesota is that any kind of notion of due process or full review of issues is being shut down. And that ought to concern everyone in Minnesota. We don't have a good process for discussing these issues at the Capitol. And
even when it comes to children and their well-being. And Governor Walz is just fine with that. He signed right off on it. Let's just spend a minute on the person who sponsored the bill, Representative Lee Finke, who is a Democratic Farmer Labor Party. That's how Lee is described. 42 years old. Lee is the first openly transgender member of the Minnesota legislature. Lee is quite clearly a man posing as a woman. And Lee is, and there you can see Governor Walz right behind Lee. Lee is responsible for a lot of the radical legislation that's getting pushed through in Minnesota. This one in particular, Bob, I don't know whether Lee has any biological children of his own, but Lee has effectively managed to endanger everyone else's thanks to pushing this through.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. I don't know much about Lee personally, other than what you just went through, but why this person is being given so much power by the administration is mind-boggling.
Right.
The influence there is just, what's going on? People in Minnesota ought to be just freaking out over this. And it takes a lot to get Minnesotans freaked out because they're pretty passive aggressive, as many know. But this, if this doesn't wake them up, I don't know what would.
Do they not know, Bob? Do you think they don't know? Do you think they believe? Because right now, I said this a couple of months ago on my show, and all these people tried to fact check me saying, this is not true, it's not true, it's not true. So then they believe it's not true. But it's true. It is true. And Governor Walz, go ahead and sue me. If it's not true, sue me. Sue me for defamation, for defaming you here openly. Let's have that litigation. It's true. And so he can't. But go ahead, Bob. Do they not know?
Well, and I was threatened on the Senate floor. I mean, not by name, but one of the senators sponsoring the bill said this attorney ought to be reported to the bars. And I said in my mind, please do. Let's get that discussion in the news. Something. It has to get out in the open, because these private, empty threats are ridiculous. I mean, they know that what I'm saying is true. I mean, it's absolutely rock solid. I'm not partisan. I care about kids. My whole career has been around family law and, trying to make things better for kids. And this is about kids' own welfare and their well-being. And they've politicized this thing like crazy.
Yeah, well, I think to that point, a lot of parents are shocked when they hear about this. It's one of the things we hear all the time when parents call us. And we've had a case in Michigan and Colorado and other places where these schools are transitioning kids and they're hiding it from parents. And these parents call us and they're shocked because in their mind, they're thinking, surely the government's not going to take away my kid. They're not going to interfere. They're going to let me know if my child is struggling with gender confusion. In fact, when you talk to parents, left, right, whatever they are on the political aisle, they agree that they ought to be the first call when this is happening. So I think there is a sense of parents like disbelief that Minnesota would do something like this, that they would actually say, you are an unfit parent. We're going to strip away custody of you if you don't immediately put your kids on these dangerous puberty blockers and hormones. So I think conversations like this, where we let parents know this is happening no matter where you are in the country. This isn't just a California or a Massachusetts issue. It's happening in Minnesota. It's happening all over the country where these policies and these laws are being pushed that undermine parental rights, that push kids down these one-way streets towards gender identity. And what the message parents need to know is be on the lookout. Don't assume that your school that you love has your best interest, because quite often we're seeing they're adopting policies and they're pushing this stuff on kids and sometimes even intentionally hiding it from parents. For example, I mentioned the Michigan case. The family there, this had been happening for months that the school was changing their records, changing documents before they sent them home to the mom and dad to erase the fact that the school was treating their daughter as a young boy. And it wasn't until a slip up happened and a document came home and the teacher forgot to catch it and make the correction that the parents found out that this had been happening for months. This is the type of deception that's happening. It's the type of actions by the government that are undermining parental rights. And what we're seeing in Minnesota is it being taken to a whole new level, where now the full force of state law and power to judges to take away parental rights is being pushed there. And it ought to be a real wake-up call for families across the state and across the country.
Once you allow social transition, which these schools are doing in so many states without the parents' knowledge or consent, that child almost always pursues the rest, because it's very difficult to reverse once you've come out and said, oh, I'm a different gender and I'm dressing like that different gender and acting and changing my name. It's very hard for these kids to then say, I made a mistake and go back on it. Before you know it, these so-called harmless puberty blockers are given, which cause all sorts of potential health risks to the brain, to the body, to the bones, and then it straight into cross-sex hormones. And sure enough, your odds of becoming completely sterile are through the roof. And your odds of ever having sexual pleasure, as I said in that clip, are, all but predetermined. And I received this information in the first instance from trans activists who are on tape being honest about this in talking about the risk before people they don't think will criticize them. But it's verified. I mean, that it's not even a controversial thing to say. They will admit that on the other side. And so, Matt, they take these kids who are having the normal growing pains that we all went through, and they fast track them into these radical drugs and then surgeries, all outside the care of their parents. That's what Walz blessed, which is why I was angry in that particular clip at Taylor Swift. It's not her fault, but I actually think Taylor Swift probably had no idea that she just blessed this regime the three of us have just discussed.
Yeah, I would encourage her, sit down with the detransitioners. Sit down with people like Chloe Cole or Prisha Mosley that went through this, that had the doctors pushing them to take the hormones, that had the doctors pushing them to have their breast removed, and sit down and hear their stories where they said, I just wish someone had said, wait a second, it's okay that you don't feel comfortable in your body, but that doesn't mean you need to take these hormones. That doesn't mean you need to undergo these surgeries. Because when you hear those stories and you see how these kids were manipulated and pushed towards this, you would stand out and speak out against any law like what passed in Minnesota. And you would say, we don't want to judge stepping in, taking custody away from parents, and putting a child on these irreversible surgeries and drugs that can do lifelong damage to them. Because as you said, Megyn, once that damage is done, it can't be undone. And we're ending up with more and more stories of detransitioners speaking out and just saying, I wish someone, an adult in the room, would have just said, wait a second, pause, let's think through this. And what Walz is doing in Minnesota with this law is fast tracking those kids and now putting the full weight of Minnesota law and courts behind them. Imagine you now have a judge saying, yes, young girl, we're going to get you this surgery. We're going to get you these hormones, and how difficult it is for that child to step back from that. But that is where we're pushing these children to.
Removing the adults in the room who care most about the child, who are the parents. But Bob, you told me something interesting a couple months ago, which is in Minnesota, you can't find a therapist now who's going to explore these issues with the child and have an honest discussion about whether this is divorce related or, God forbid, a sexual abuse that's coming back to haunt a young girl, which we see in a lot of these so-called trans kids. They're just dealing with, problems as a result of abuse, real abuse, because they consider that now conversion therapy.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole nother discussion, a whole nother show probably. But the whole conversion, and that's another euphemism, a made up word, and it's meant to insult Christians because it's using the word conversion. And what they're actually talking about is simply therapy that explores with the patient what are they desire, what are their desires for their life, and are there things that are getting in the way and frustrating that. And just having an honest, open conversation with self-directed therapy, they can't do it because it's basically, we'd say, one way to gay policy now on professional counseling and therapy. That's a whole nother discussion. But that's the environment that's been created here in Minnesota. And now the administration's got taken steps to put teeth into enforcement of this, because they know very well that many outstate county agencies are probably going to be very hesitant and to go down this road and get kids permanently hormone treatments and surgeries. So there's been a commission created, a new one in Minnesota that I'm just finding out more about now. But the nightmare's not over; it's getting worse.
That would do what? What would they do? The commission?
They would override. Yeah, they would be able to override the discretion of these county child welfare agencies that are technically a part of the state system, but are contextualized in the community they're in for the most part. And this commission would have the ability to override their discretion and enforce these policies.
God. So you're telling me that if a more conservative leaning or just rational county has a child and protective services person who says, I've evaluated little Sally, and you know what? She confessed to me that she was the victim of a sexual assault when she was very young on some trip with some stranger. And I think that's really what's going on here. I don't think we should be aggressively intervening with this girl with cross-sex hormones and surgeries before this is explored and understood. That now Minnesota is creating a commission that would remove the judgment of the child and protective services person to just full steam ahead it with little Sally.
Potentially. And it's, again, yet to be seen what all the details would be on this, but I don't want to overstate it, but the fact that this commission's been created and it has the ability to intervene in this decision making in any county in the state is very concerning.
I don't even know. I mean, it's just when you think you've gotten to the full darkness, Matt, you learn something else. I don't know what to say. I don't think this is in any way the kind of policy that could pass at the federal level, no matter what Tim Walz and Kamala Harris try to do if they win. I just don't think, even with a Democrat-controlled Senate, potentially, I'm just talking worst-case scenario here, and a Democrat-controlled House, I can't imagine that this kind of thing would be passed, but I suppose we shouldn't rule anything out. But there can be influence on policies by a sitting president and vice president, state after state after state. And there are things that can be done at the federal level to make it all easier and faster and to destigmatize it. And I worry a lot about even that level of federal interference. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree, Megyn. The power of whether it's an executive order or agency action. Remember, a lot of where we're seeing gender ideology being pushed at the federal level is through these federal agencies, these bureaucrats. So whether it's the Title IX rule that's being rewritten to erase sex in federal law and replace it with gender identity, that has all come through these executive actions, through these administrative rules. And so we have got to be on the lookout. We can't just say, well, this is only happening in Minnesota or California. These types of policies are already being pushed at the federal level. So we've got to be vigilant. We've got to educate. We've got to point out these stories, but they are popping up everywhere. I mean, even yesterday in Kentucky, Governor Beshear did an executive order on one of these so-called conversion therapy counselor censorship laws. So they're using every power that they have at the executive level to do it. And at Alliance Defending Freedom, we're going to continue to stand against it, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. We're going to stand against these laws and stand with families and kids to protect them from these dangerous drugs and surgeries.
Thank God for Alliance Defending Freedom. Thank God. I thank God every day for you guys. And I mean, the number of things they've already done with Title IX, saying it's discriminatory not to let the boys into the girls' bathrooms and locker rooms, and then they expanded it, saying it's now discriminatory in the workplace. It's hostile work environment. If you don't use preferred pronouns, well, I won't. Go ahead and sue me. And what's to stop them from saying, oh, it's discriminatory not to treat as abuse a parent's decision not to, quote, affirm and offer these, quote, life-saving gender-affirming care options like this Lee Finke has been trying to push on us. And for what it's worth, I mean, my view on Lee is Lee made some very bad life choices. And as many people do, they then want to see those choices repeated by others, and it's somehow validated to them. And this is why, in my opinion, this Lee is working so hard to pave the way to this very difficult lifestyle he's chosen for himself, for all of our children. And he's going to get his way unless we continue speaking the truth. You guys, thank you. Thank you so much to you, Bob. You've been so helpful. And you, Matt, honestly, Alliance Defending Freedom is the best. And to all of you listening, if you want to donate to them, they can use it and it'll be put to good use. All the best, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megyn.
Good to be here.
Oh, it's like, honestly, I wish I weren't right. I wish, it's upsetting to talk about. This is so deeply wrong. To my fellow women who are on the fence in this election, I know Trump can be an asshole. I know you don't like his temperament. I know January 6th was bad. You're voting for this regime that we just went through if you vote Harris Walz. You're blessing this. You're elevating the man who did it to bigger, greater, more widespread power. I'm begging you to reconsider. Begging you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Did you know that there is nearly $1 trillion of infrastructure and pandemic funds yet to be spent? That's right, there's a massive amount of money that this lame duck administration is pushing hard to spend in their last few months. If the president is able to push these funds out, we could see another prolonged inflation surge, just like we did during COVID. But there's hope. A gold IRA from Birch Gold Group can be an inflation hedge for your savings in uncertain times. To see how to protect your IRA or 401k, get your free info kit on gold by texting MK to 989898. Birch Gold makes it seamless to roll over your retirement account while preserving your tax-advantaged status. Don't wait for the president's spending spree to potentially tank the dollar further. Protect your financial future right now. Text MK to the number 989898 for your free info kit from Birch Gold.